Welcome back. This week, we're going to be continuing our reading of Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. And I want us to continue to think about how Northanger Abbey functions as a parody. Now, last week, we discussed how parody works. As a reminder, parody is a form of comic writing that takes its humor from imitating a literary convention or a genre. And it does so in three ways. It can do so through exaggeration. So, for example, a parody of a slasher movie might have a really gory scene that's so completely over the top that it's actually kind of humorous. It does so through minimization. So, for example, in the first Austin Powers, Dr. Evil tries to hold the world ransom for $1 million. And then he has to be told by his aides that $1 million is not that much money. Or a parody works by applying a certain set of conventions but to an inappropriate subject matter. And we saw that in the video last week of the gadget reveal parody in the Spy movie, where Melissa McCarthy's character isn't given a fancy car, a fancy cell phone. She's given like foot fungus medication and hemorrhoid wipes. All right, so last week we really talked about how parody functions. Now, I want us to begin to analyze why people write parodies, specifically why Jane Austen is writing her parody. So, people write parodies for different reasons. Sometimes people write parodies just to be funny. There's no particular motive in mind other than just to make their audience laugh. And sometimes people write parodies in order to offer a social critique. Parody is ultimately a form of satire. And as a form of satire, its purpose is to hold a mirror up to society in order to show society something objectionable. So, oftentimes, what a parody is trying to show society is society's own hypocrisy or the hypocrisy of some of its members. Now, SNL does this type of parody all the time. For example, Tina Fey parodied Sarah Palin by adopting Sarah Palin's mannerisms and speech patterns, and Alec Baldwin did the same thing with Donald Trump. But SNL has also done that in order to parody cultural ideas, especially cultural beliefs about women versus the reality of women's everyday lives. And once you finish with this video, I'm going to show you a link to an SNL video that does exactly that, that parodies gender conditions in today's society. So, one thing to keep in mind is that when writers write parodies, they're oftentimes doing it for multiple purposes. It would be very rare to find a writer who is writing a parody solely as a form of social critique or solely to make you laugh. So, what's more common is within one work, a writer might produce some parodic elements just to be funny. They might do so in other moments of the same text in order to parody a genre. And then in other moments of the text, they might be trying to parody a cultural belief. And I think this is what's going on in Northanger Abbey. I think Austen actually is parodying multiple different things, and she's doing so at different times in her work. Sometimes she's parodying a sentimental fiction, sometimes she's parodying a gothic fiction. And through these, she is satirizing society's views about and treatment of women. So, in the time remaining, I want to give you some background information about women in Regency society. And then I want to ask you how Austen uses her parodic novel as a form of critique. So, we've started talking about 18th century and Regency society and gender relations before. If you'll recall, we began this discussion when we were studying Evelina. And here are some of the things that we discussed that were just a part of 18th and early 19th century society's views of women. First of all, 18th and 19th century society, which would encompass the time periods when Frances Burney and Jane Austen were writing, society was extremely patriarchal. Women were expected to be obedient to men, in particular to their fathers, to their husbands, or to their male guardians. And their subservience was underwritten by legal, economic, and social practices. So let's take the legal. Legally, in the 18th and 19th century, there is no divorce. It is possible in cases of domestic abuse for couples to get a legal separation from one another. But in those cases, women were not allowed to maintain custody of their children. Women also couldn't vote in this era. They didn't gain the vote until the 20th century. Women also really didn't have as many rights as men had when it came to property. Women could certainly own property and they could certainly own money, but there were some caveats. First of all, inheritances tended to pass from oldest son to oldest son, which cut women out of that line of property and money that they could gain. Um, Now, women were typically given a dowry, which was a certain amount of money and land when she married. But all of that money in that dowry actually passed into her husband's ownership. She was secured, usually through a contract in their marriage, the right to what was called pin money, which is sort of an allowance to purchase, clothes or cosmetics or things that she might like. And then she was given a small retirement income called a jointure. But that was it. Her husband controlled the rest of the money that she had. And if he wanted to, he might even be able to go after her pin money. Um, so, as this suggests, there was enough wiggle room and so few protections of women in the 18th and 19th century that husbands could treat their wives like really pretty badly, and they could do so without a lot of legal repercussions. Um, Now, economically, there weren't a lot of jobs available to women where they could earn a livable wage. Women in the 18th and 19th century were expected to become wives and mothers. If they worked, it might be to help out their husband in a shop or in his business, but that was kind of about it. The only available jobs to women were jobs as teachers and governesses, as domestic servants, or as prostitutes. And the idea was that a woman shouldn't need to work because her husband or her father or, let's say, a guardian would take care of her, would make all the decisions for her, control her money, and then provide her with material comforts. Now, even though that was the idea that undergirded the lack of economic opportunity for women, that really didn't happen in all cases. And there were cases of women who, were in bad marriages, they needed to leave their marriage, or they weren't married, they needed to earn money, and they had very limited opportunities to do so. And then finally, women's legal and economic status was shored up by cultural beliefs about women's minds and bodies. So, women in the 18th and 19th century were thought to be physically weaker than men. They were thought to be more emotional than men, and they were thought to be less rational than men, and thus less capable of learning complex subjects and thinking logically. And one of the results is that women's education was vastly deficient compared to that of men. Women, if they went to school or if they had a governess, they were taught reading, writing, arithmetic, sewing, drawing, dancing, and social comportment. And that really was about it. The end goal of a woman's education in the 18th and 19th century was to marry well, often by going to places like Bath or London, as Evelina and as Catherine Morland do. And the idea surrounding a woman's education was that a woman should be educated just enough to attract a man into marriage. And then the man would essentially sort of finish educating his wife over the course of their courtship and their marriage, in order for her to become the companion that he really wanted. That was a kind of philosophical underpinning to what was expected of women. And we see this type of relationship, or this sort of ideal relationship, showcased again and again in sentimental fiction in the 18th and 19th centuries. So we saw that in Evelina. We're seeing it a little bit as well in Northanger Abbey. So sentimental fiction turned on the following idea. It followed a courtship in which a beautiful, innocent young woman meets a nice young man, usually someplace in London or in Bath, or in another resort area. Over the course of their courtship, the young man looks out for the young woman. He protects her from any dangers, and he gradually begins to mentor her about society's corruptions and also about things that he finds important, such as reading that he finds important or moral ideas that he finds important. Um, and then the young woman, through that courtship, gains in wisdom and maturity, and then her marriage is meant to symbolize her entry into adulthood. Now that's the fiction. That's the fiction that gets told over and over again in sentimental novels. In reality, historians know that this fiction really did not match reality. And I'll give you the example of a woman named Charlotte Smith. Charlotte Smith was a contemporary of Jane Austen and also of Frances Burney. And she was also a very famous novelist in her own day. Now, Charlotte Smith had, in some ways, a very Evelina-like introduction into society. She had been fairly well educated. Her father was getting remarried, and her new potential stepmother didn't like her, so her family needed to get her married before him. They introduced her into London society. She met what she thought was a nice young man. They had a courtship, and they got married. And he was very wealthy. Turns out he wasn't such a nice young man. He blew through her money. He blew through his own money. He became the executor of his father's estate. He blew through and mismanaged most of that. He wound up for 9 months in what was called debtor's prison. You could be thrown into prison in the 18th century for being in debt. Charlotte Smith had to go into prison with him. After they got out, they immigrated to France. And from there, he left her. He ran off, leaving her penniless to take care of their 12 children. And he did come back from time to time throughout the rest of their life, but it was only to go into her home and plunder her of any ready money that she had at that point. So Charlotte Smith ended up actually turning to novel writing as a way of making money, and she ended up actually having to hide most of her assets from her husband by striking a deal with her publisher where she would have all of her bills sent to him and he would deduct it from her salary. Charlotte Smith's husband could do this over the course of their life with absolutely no legal penalty, maybe with the occasional raised eyebrow of society. And that's because of that kind of cultural fantasy that was undergirding the treatment of women, a cultural fantasy that we find played out in sentimental fiction where young women need to be sort of protected and educated. So as you continue reading Northanger Abbey, I want you to identify two things. One, how does Austen parody the Gothic in the second half of the novel? And two, how does Austen's parody function as a form of social critique? All right, I look forward to seeing you on the discussion board.